Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Dani Nierenberg. I am president and co-founder of Food Tank, which is a research and advocacy organization devoted. Turn it on. I think you heard me, right? We're devoted to telling stories of hope and success and sharing them around food systems and worldwide. So thank you all for being here. This is a really important panel, and I'm sorry that there aren't more of you in here, but we will be broadcasting this to Food Tank's audience in the coming days, because what we're going to discuss today over the next 40-45 minutes is the importance of systems that have long been ignored. Our global grassland and savanna systems provide extraordinary benefits. I can't tell you, our panelists will, but they provide so many benefits that are completely sort of hidden to both human livelihoods and the environment. They are rich with biodiversity and can sequester carbon very effectively. So today we are joined by this great group of experts who will help us work towards making sure that these ecosystems are no longer ignored, that at the next COP they are front and center as they should be. So let me just introduce everyone very quickly. I'm pleased to have Karina Berg here, the Global Grasslands and Savannahs Initiative Lead at WWF. Thank you so much. And I want to thank Karina for putting this wonderful panel together and coming to Food Tank through our connections at WWF to make sure that this happened.
Thank you.
I think you need to flip the switch. And maybe, Karina, if you want to say a few words about your work real quick.
Yeah, thanks for having me here. And yeah, I'm leading a new initiative at WWF on global grass and savannas. So it's the first time also that we're starting to pull together a framework looking across all the different regions in the world where these systems exist. So that's what I'm kind of coordinating and spearheading at the moment.
That's
Thanks for having me.
Oh, thanks for being here. So we are also joined by Cole Gordon. He is a seed researcher, a baker, I love it, and a son of a farmer who works on indigenous land practices here in Scotland, seed diversity, decolonization, and regional foods. And I'm also happy that Dr. Carolyn Lehman, is here. She's a tropical biologist at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh and a senior lecturer at the University of Edinburgh, where her work focuses on understanding how savannas and grasslands respond to climate, fire, animals, and people. All very interesting. So thank you all again for being here. I'd like to hand it to you, Karina, to sort of give us an overview of what we'll be discussing.
Thanks. Yeah, it's really great to have the opportunity to put grasslands and savannas in the spotlight, because I should start by saying, actually, I have nothing against trees and forests, but the conservation sector has done really well at highlighting their relevance and significance, and particularly when it comes to climate. And we can see that with the pledges and announcements that have been coming out here at COP. But in this growing urgency to focus on forests, we seem to have overlooked almost every single other ecosystem that is on our planet. And it's really important that this perspective is changed, and pretty urgently. It needs to be reframed. So as the eyes of the world are on COP over these 2 weeks, I think we need to make sure that they're opened to all the other systems that are really important as well. And grass and savannas significantly contribute not just to the climate ambitions, but equally to the nature crisis that we're facing, and to how people live, their livelihoods, and to also how we feed this growing population. So I'm just going to try and put a bit of a global context for everyone as a starting point. Forests consist of about 31% of our land surface. That's quite a big number. But when we talk about grass and savannas and these extensive biomes where they're mainly open and low shrubs, there are trees in some of them, but collectively they're about 54%. That's over half of our land surface that is currently not really being recognised. And it confuses me as to why they don't really feature into the public consciousness or the political arenas when we talk about nature and climate and our food production. They do really matter. So I think there's something in what this narrative that's generated around forests, that there's a sense that if there's no trees, then there's no value, and that's completely far from it. So these grassy biomes were actually the birthplace of our humanity. We've completely forgotten about that. And for many communities, they still hold a massive cultural value. and significance. So an example is the Lakota people in the Northern Great Plains. They believe that their creation and the buffalo that was so intrinsic in the landscape are one of the same. That's just one example of many around the globe. These landscapes, they're so incredibly biodiverse, and you can, from the big charismatic species that roam the African plains to the last great migrating herds of like the Saiga antelope in Kazakhstan, and then not forgetting the thousands and thousands of pollinators that are hidden. We don't even see them. And I think that's part of the challenge, is that people don't see what's actually living there. Millions of people make grassland savannas their home. So it's about 25% of our global population is living in these landscapes. And millions more rely on the ecosystem services that they provide, from food production to water security, pollination services I've already mentioned. And I can't really be at COP and not mention the carbon sequestration potential. About 70 to 80% of our agriculturally productive lands are also in these grassland biomes. So it's really important that the integrity and the long-term health of these biomes, it's crucial for people and for nature alike. So if we just talk about carbon for 1 second, the majority of the carbon stocks in these landscapes is hidden below ground. And so I think, it's something that people can't see, but some of these root systems, and if you look at the systems in Brazil's Cerrado, they're thought to go down to about 18 meters. And that's, to put that in context, about 3 times the height of your typical 2-story house here. So they're pretty spectacular systems. But when it comes to countries' commitments around carbon and climate mitigation plans, there's only about 10% of the countries that reference the protection and restoration of these grassland systems. Apart from that, there's this steadfast focus on forests and trees. And these grassy biomes are really under threat. They're facing some of the largest and fastest rates of conversion than any other biome around the planet, and the degradation that comes with it. And it's predominantly linked to agriculture production. So that's with livestock and crops. And then there's the changing climate we're seeing that's also exacerbating the impacts in these landscapes. In the Mongolian steppe, it's this huge, great big Asian grass and landscape. They're experiencing warming temperatures that are nearly 3 times the global average. Wow. So we're really starting to see impacts on these landscapes. I think it's really important to say that every natural ecosystem has its own intrinsic value. And it's not one is more important than the others, forests are more important than grasses. It's everything has its own value, and they all count. So we really have to nurture them all. We've got to protect them, think about the sustainable management, and we've got to restore them to the natural state once they're degraded. If we're really serious about addressing the challenges that we have ahead of us, we need to level the playing field. So ensuring that grasslands and savannas are valued and take their rightful place in the climate, conservation and development agendas is what we really need to focus on. I'll stop there.
That was great. Thank you so much. I learned so much just from that brief overview. And I think it's important to remember that it's not just that forests are over here and grasslands are over here. These are all things that are interconnected. And if we can focus our attention on making those linkages and connecting the dots, so to speak, which we've been talking about all week, that's a very, very important part of this conversation that I'm sure we'll dig into in a little bit. So, Cole, I'd like to turn to you if possible. I mean, from my understanding, you have this really rich understanding of Scotland's landscapes and how they have evolved over time and how they work effectively to do all the things that Karina was talking about: protect that rich biodiversity, provide livelihoods, sequester carbon. Can you tell us a little bit about Scottish grasslands and why they're important?
Thank you. So the first thing about Scotland is to mention is 51% of the land capability is classed agriculturally as only able to support rough grazing. So this is a very upland landscape, which is not capable of intensive agriculture my background, I'm involved in farming and food production, but that landscape is not really utilised in a way that takes a lot of these things into account, particularly with regards to grassland. We see it as a wilderness sometimes, maybe a wasteland to a certain extent, somewhere that doesn't have a huge amount of value. Whereas this was, for a vast majority of Scotland's history, this was a place where people were able to have a subsistence, which was a very, very culturally rich one, and at the same time maintain a very, very diverse and rich natural habitat. The uplands were not, prior to a couple of hundred years ago, they were not what they are today. They were much, much more rich with grasses, meadows, wildflowers, as well as all sorts of other things, and a kind of savanna type landscape with a lot more old veteran trees that would not be just monoculture type things. You would have interspersed in amongst these really rich grasslands. There would be these old trees that would support all sorts of insects and all sorts of wildlife. But I think these landscapes aren't utilised and they're not recognised in that ways now. And now they're seen as somewhat of a blank canvas to plant with trees. There's lots of biomes that are, as well as the grassland. Within that, this is part of the grassland, these peatlands and that are part of that. But it is a mosaic. It always has been, but we're not recognising that.
Yeah, I mean, and we'll get into that, but I love that it's described as a mosaic, because that gives it some sort of value, sort of, as well. Calling it something else, calling it a rich mosaic of trees and plants and biodiversity. I think that's really a wonderful way to think about it. Dr. Lehman, I'd like to turn to you and really give us an overview of how these systems are so connected to people and to plants and to animals and to the pollinators Karina mentioned.
Thanks very much, and thanks for these beautiful introductions. I think you've both done such a wonderful job at summarising things. So I guess I wanted to pick up probably on what Cole has just mentioned about wastelands, and then Karina's been talking about this unique biodiversity, how they support people, and I think about it in these different worldviews that people place on these savannas and grasslands. And in terms of these kinds of, if we look at maps, for instance, of India or Madagascar or different parts of the world, grasslands and savannas were historically mapped by kind of colonial explorers often as kinds of wastelands. And so this notion of wasteland is actually one that's surprisingly common, or it's a degraded forest. And I think this is where we're starting to see the origins of why right now this global discourse around ecosystems, carbon and climate centres on forests, because these systems have already been discarded for hundreds of years. And then if you kind of have a biologist point of view, like me, I walk into these places and I'm obsessed with small plants and animals, and they're actually incredibly biodiverse. They have a unique endemic flora and fauna across these wide ranges of climates on Earth. And like Karina was saying, they're also incredibly resilient. So they're really resilient to processes that people inherently think of as destructive. So where fire is a destructive process of degradation in forests, it's a process of renewal in savannas and grasslands. Yes. And so that's this biological perspective. And then there's this human worldview as well, where people have been living and were evolving in these landscapes for millions of years and have lived and co-evolved in these landscapes for thousands of years. And so they have huge cultural value. And then here we are in this kind of space of this global discussion and global space where I think kind of discourse gets narrowed to sound bites. And so it's easier to focus on restoration and reforestation because we haven't perhaps spent enough time really delving into the really important ecological and also social nuance of the meaning and the value of a diversity of ecosystems, which leads us here.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I want to get back to this question. I mean, we've heard, we've touched on it a little bit, why they're ignored. So what I heard from you, Dr. Lehman, is some colonialist structures made this happen. So racism, inherent sort of lack of understanding of the role that they provide and how they can be sort of rich treasures, but maybe we're glad that they weren't sort of used in the same way as forests. But we've ignored them for many, many different reasons, and I really want to get into that. Why do policy, if we know the importance, which you are mapping, if we know the importance, why don't we pay more attention to them?
Is that from a policy perspective?
It's from, I think, all sorts of different perspectives. I mean, if I ask, my neighbors or my mom, about grasslands, she's a very smart woman, but she's not going to say like, oh, I think they're important as forests are. I think forests have lots of fluffy animals and lots of things that we can identify as biodiverse, and we can't identify the same things in grasslands.
I feel like some of it's to do with the fact that there's it's a bit soundbitey, like Caroline says.
Yeah.
You can say we're going to restore and we're going to plant X number of trees, and it's something really tangible that people can get hold of. Whereas with the grassy systems, it's like they're still thinking that, well, you can't cut trees down, so you then can't, because they're not there. But you can't, if you restore them, what are you restoring? Because it's just grass, right? So it's almost that something connected so visually. And I think there's been so many years of conservation that's focused around the loss of forests, because I think the difference between the trees standing and then them being taken down is so stark that it seems like a shocking thing to see. And so, and just the link with forests, you've got forests and then you deforest them, so they're quite easy, understandable concepts. And I think it's the same thing. A lot of my friends and family that I speak to, when I say, "Oh, grasslands are really important," it's like, well, I had no idea,
right? Because
it's like the trees have stole the limelight, and they are important. They have their value, but when you think about historically where we come from, actually, it was those open landscapes that were really important. And I think it's just trying to understand and help expand this narrative, and it's the narrative that's lacking. And it almost, I don't know whether the social media age has something to do with that. It's like people don't have time to listen to the full sentence. Because if you're talking about policy, and if you look to the pledge that was made on deforestation, it's great to see countries getting behind that. But if they just added 2 words, deforestation and conversion, to that pledge,
right, it
it already incorporates so much more than just forests. And it almost feels like, oh, well, we'll use shorthand of deforestation. It does refer to all land, but it's not very easily understood for most people who have grown up hearing about the loss of forests and the loss of trees. And now that the solution is, oh, we must just plant trees.
Absolutely. It sounds like we have a communication problem, and I feel like social media can be both a detriment, but also could be helpful. And Cole, if I can turn to you to talk about this idea of different storytelling, different narratives around how we think about the importance of grasslands. I mean, I think we've come to a time in history right now where people understand the importance of pollinators. And so if we can, help people understand that these are rich, lots of different kinds of pollinators live in grassland systems, for example. But how do we change sort of the communication around grasslands?
I think that the grassland can be very complex, but it can also be seen as being very simple in terms of our understanding from in a broad way. So a field, a farmer's field, might only contain a single species of grass, and that might be what we understand as grassland, is just a field of ryegrass or a golf course. Whereas grassland is incredibly complex. It's very, very species rich and can support all of these things. The biodiversity is huge, and we know that in open, certainly in this kind of landscape, open, not closed canopy forests, so open, what's the word? So an open system can support a lot more biodiversity than a closed one in this particular landscape. And I think that is something that we can start to work with as storytellers to encourage people to see that grassland and savanna type wood pasture can be incredibly rich, incredibly useful for a lot of these massive issues that we're trying to deal with.
Absolutely.
But as you say, it's not got those fluffy bits in the same way.
Right, yeah. We don't have an animal
other than sheep.
Dr. Lehman, you know, for storytellers to be able to do their jobs effectively, they need the research behind it. So what kind of research is missing around grasslands right now that we need to invest more in?
Have you got an hour? Gosh, you know, like, I think we're missing actually some fundamental evaluation of biodiversity of grasslands and savannas in very particular parts of the world. So, for instance, where Karina has had a history of working in the Cerrado in Brazil, it's a global biodiversity hotspot, and the vast majority of that biodiversity are small plants in the ground layer. They're often quite hard to observe because they're not like a tree, they're not permanently there in the landscape. They're there maybe for flowering for 5 weeks of the year. So unless you're kind of revisiting sites quite frequently, you actually never observe the full set of diversity in that system. But of course, those different wonderful small plants also probably have very specialised pollinator relationships as well. So there's a whole kind of phenological cycle that we actually are still not fully to grips with, I think, in these savannas and grasslands. There has been more work on that here in these temperate systems than there has been, for instance, in the African systems.
Sure.
So there's that kind of stuff. I guess also in terms of selling savannas and grasslands with fluffy animals, we don't have fluffy animals, but we do have very big charismatic animals.
Right.
And I think it's really useful to remember actually that the last vestiges of the Pleistocene megafauna actually exist in savannas and grasslands. And that is something that is incredibly valuable and something that is disappearing.
Absolutely.
That by conserving them, we will also be conserving these ecosystems as well.
I'm wondering what you would like your colleagues to do to better tell the story and to better sort of describe what they need from university and academic systems, from research institutions to do this work.
I think one of the key things we need is this ecological nuance. One of the key issues right now is the lack of ability in global policy to distinguish between what is a degraded forest and what is a savanna ecosystem, because structurally they look quite the same. It's a ground layer of grasses with some trees in it. And so for some people that's a degraded forest, and that's actually how the UNFCCC sees a degraded forest, right? But that actually, by doing that, you umbrella a huge number of savanna ecosystems that are naturally with low tree cover. So I think in terms of kind of communicating and evaluating the research we need to essentially bring biodiversity back into these global definitions of how we view ecosystems, because so much and so often I hear the Amazon's being converted to a savanna. Actually, no, it's not. It's being converted to a degraded forest.
Right.
A savanna is a unique biodiverse ecosystems with its own unique biodiversity. So I think we need to bring biodiversity back into biomes.
That's great. That's a great way to put it. You mentioned something I found interesting before, this idea of like selling grasslands to selling them, like branding them in a way where people can sort of like wrap their heads around them and think of them as more sexy, I guess. And so how does that translate, Karina, when we're talking about policy? How do we sell this to policymakers?
I think it's about just also helping the understanding of the value that they have, and particularly when, I mentioned the importance of these systems for our food production, and a lot of that, and I think generally ecologically as well, the importance of the biodiversity is so reliant on the soils and healthy soils. And then the people that live there, equally, if they don't have a healthy system that they're living in, they can't then produce for themselves or make a living. So I think it's just about really being explicit about those really important links that somehow seem to be overlooked, because I can guarantee you, if you go and speak to any community in any of these grasslands or savanna systems around the world, they'll be able to very easily tell you why a healthy system is so important for them and the value that brings, not just for them. And then when you take a step back, and I talked about the importance of some of these systems for other ecosystem services they provide. So the freshwater piece,
Right.
speaking to different colleagues I work with around the world, go back to Brazil, the Cerrado is the source of 8 out of 12 water basins in Brazil. And if you go to South Africa, their most important grasslands are also their water tables for a very water scarce country. And the same, and you can equally speak to people who live in the cities in the Andean countries like Peru, Ecuador. Their water's produced on these high mountain grasslands. And so it's almost like we've not made those links explicit
Right,
enough, because if you speak to people who live there and rely on them, it's really obvious.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Policymakers should be going out and talking more to actual people who live in these areas for sure. Cole, we've been talking a lot about tropical areas and the importance of savannas and grasslands, but they're also equally important in Scotland and the United States, where there's a lot of work to restore grasslands in places like where I grew up in the American Midwest, but we still aren't making those connections. What is the average sort of Scottish person? I'm sure the farmers you work with understand the importance of grasslands, but do Scottish folks understand how the history and the current state of grasslands here in the UK? I mean, it's like a yes or no question. I'm sorry I set you up for that.
I think there's an understanding of the importance of grassland, but again, I think like maybe we see a certain type of grassland that maybe doesn't support all these multiple benefits.
Sure.
So there's a lot of very improved grassland, and that's kind of quote unquote improved, which doesn't have the biodiversity in it, which doesn't maintain a lot of these pollinators. We don't. I don't think we recognise that type of landscape. These diverse, meadow-rich, kind of less intensive type landscapes. That's changing, but I think it's changing quite slowly, particularly from a sort of a farmer point of view. And I think there's a lot of room for landscape managers who are involved in farming to work more in that kind of way.
Absolutely.
And work with people more in whether it's conservation or whatever, to try to move in that direction, which is slightly less intensive. We heard in the last discussion about some of the stuff around debate around meat, and one thing is that grassland has evolved with ruminants.
Absolutely.
And that's a really important part of this, is just where these ruminants fit into all these talks, because grasslands don't exist in isolation from.
Absolutely. Can you elaborate on that, the importance of livestock for maintaining grasslands if it's done in a managed, holistic, good way?
Yeah, I mean, we know that, for instance, if you manage lands, if there is severe overgrazing, across Scotland and the wider world, that's a fact that livestock have played a massive role in degradation of these landscapes and biomes. But that's not to say that they shouldn't be part of them, because they've always been part of them, and they play a crucial role in maintaining a healthy grass-based grassland landscape. The nutrient cycling that they're able to do is crucial. The way that the biomass management, so the action of grazing, is beneficial to the maintenance of these landscapes, but it has to be done at certain times, in certain ways, at certain densities, for certain lengths of time.
Right.
And if we go over the boundaries within those, then the landscapes will become degraded, and that it's a balancing act. But there's
Sure.
Yeah.
It's a very knowledge-intensive system for farmers.
Absolutely, yeah. It's very knowledge intensive, but also I think time intensive as well.
Sure.
to get there. So the uptake if we're going to if farmers are going to work with these type of systems, as you say, very, very knowledge intensive, potentially a lot more time intensive, and farmers are not known for having lots of free time on their hands. But so the transition to this kind of more sort of knowledge intensive, but potentially less resource intensive systems, we're starting to see it, but I think we've got a long way to go.
Well, and farmers need the financial incentive, and that's where policies come in. And I'm wondering if all three of you can talk about, from your different perspectives, what kinds of policies are needed, you know, at the national, subnational, and then sort of international level. We are here at COP trying to come up with solutions on an international level, but if we can start sort of small and then work our way up, can we go into that? Maybe you start first, Karina.
Yeah, I think it's really about making sure that what is set at the high level makes sense on the ground.
Sure.
And that's, I think, sometimes the challenge, is that maybe the policies are not really taking that into account. And part of the challenge, I think, is making sure that when you look at a landscape, you're not saying, you can't just automatically go, well, oh, that bit's not really going to be any good, we'll just get rid of that bit, and all right, well, we've got some communities there, so we'll leave them there. You need to bring everybody to the table into the discussion, so that all of the different people that are either living there or have a stake in that landscape can actually put forward their perspective and their opinions. And I think that's probably not what's happening. But as a starting point, I think we need to have explicit references to the importance of these systems at the high level, which they're not, they just haven't really been featuring. And once you've got them at a high level, you can then start to work with the decision makers. And so it's not just the policy at government level, it's also looking at the businesses that are connected to these landscapes. And we're actually starting to see quite a lot of movement, or certainly a bigger drive of that, as businesses are looking at their supply chains and going, well, we don't want to be part of these sort of conversions of these systems within our supply chain. But along that supply chain, it's not just, it's business one end, but also to the producer the other end. So again, it's that whole extent of different stakeholders that are part of it.
Right.
And today we saw the launch of the Soy Manifesto from the UK businesses, which is exactly that. It's the industry going, okay, well, how can what's our role in supporting this change that needs to happen more broadly? So every different actor needs to play its part. So we need the policy that supports that. We need the businesses to enable that, and then the finances that support the delivery on the ground. And hearing the voice of those land stewards that we have all around the world, that really are the people that have always historically looked after what's on their doorstep.
Absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned the Soy Manifesto. And Carolyn, you know, you're put in a tough spot, and I'll get into that in a second, but we have to remember that livestock, their impact on grasslands is not just through overgrazing, it's through conversion of grasslands for soy production, for other things. My understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, in the Cerrado, there's also conversion of grasslands for slaughterhouses and processing facilities for livestock that are, you know, grazing in deforested land. So there's all of these things going on. But Carolyn, you're put in a tough position as a researcher, because I'm sure you just want to do your work, right? As a scientist, do your work, but you also have to have the policy sort of part of this in mind. And also, as Karina mentioned, the people who are part of these ecosystems in mind constantly. We've heard a lot about how Indigenous peoples have been ignored at this conference and so many others. How can we bring them more into this sort of science-based conversation and look at different evidence that they're providing of the importance of grasslands? Because, you know, we can talk about pollinators and we can talk about carbon sequestration, but they are collecting evidence that, you know, it affects their lives in unimaginable ways.
I think that's a really great question that I don't have a totally simple answer for. What I guess I would say is that right now we see this gigantic disconnect between ambition and the capacity for execution in a biologically reasonable way, right? And that's largely driven out of desperation for net zero. And so because of that, we are now seeing vast amounts of money for climate finance unlocked that influences land use policy globally. And that is leading to a rush for tree planting that is like a runaway train. It is unstoppable. Right. But what we can do in that, and what I think we all want to do in that, is, I think, drive an advocacy process to ensure that biodiversity and people are brought into that. And so if there is something I can do scientifically, is I would like to kind of advocate and help formulate an evidence base for like a biodiversity and culturally appropriate restoration guide for kind of savannas and grasslands. Because right now, we're seeing eucalyptus planted in African grasslands and savannas. Terrible idea, right? On so many levels. And that is exactly what we need to avoid. But that doesn't respect the biodiversity, that doesn't respect the people, that respects a corporation looking to offset. And that's exactly what we need to stop, right? So, but acknowledging the fact that this is a runaway train, what do we do to make sure that we can mitigate for the best possible outcomes that directs finance in a way that is useful and meaningful for communities and biodiversity?
Such an important point, thank you. And making sure that those people are brought to the table, as you said before, they have to be part of this. Cole, like Carolyn, you're put in a tough position. You want to farm and you want to like do your job, but you also have to be an advocate. And that that's an extra job on a lot of farmers who don't have the capacity to do that. And I'm just wondering what your advice is for all of us as eaters, as people who rely on grasslands, even when we don't know that we do.
I think a lot of farmers at the moment are pretty scared about what's going on at the moment. It's very easy and for them to feel that they're being perceived as villains, particularly livestock farmers. And I think there needs to be more help to allow them to move in these directions that we're trying to talk about, because these are very skilled people who have a huge amount of understanding of the land that they reside on, that they work on, that they work with. And they have a real love for the land, which is something that is not easy to find, just like and the specific knowledge and care for a place. And I think in that, that needs to be something that is supported to move in directions that we're trying to, and if we're wanting to have sort of grasslands that really deliver on multiple levels. These are the people who are going to be able to help that happen, but they need to be supported because they don't have many incentives at the moment.
No.
And or maybe the incentives are kind of,
they have disincentives, right?
And I think these people just need to be supported more, not necessarily to just continue as they're doing, because that's not what we're but they are the people who have the skills.
Absolutely. And I totally agree with you that we have to stop blaming farmers for the mess the world has gotten them into, and all of us along with it. I'm wondering what your thoughts are encouraging more young farmers in this field around grasslands.
I think a lot of the younger generation of farmers, there's a lot of them who come in to this space and realize that there needs to be change already. I think there is a lot of knowledge that's coming in with a younger generation. But I think it's very hard for younger generation to get into farming, which is a different topic.
Absolutely.
But a really important one, just how do we enable these younger generation who actually, even if they're not farming already, are very knowledge rich in terms of a lot of these things, and just how do we support those people to be able to come in and become stewards is possibly a bigger question there than in terms of what to say to the people who happen to already be in there, because there needs to be more people on the ground rather than less.
Absolutely.
So yeah, it's a slightly different topic, but very connected.
It's so interconnected. So, Karina, what are the incentives? How do we get rid of the disincentives, these things that make it impossible to protect grasslands, or, and how do we incentivize protecting grasslands and, doing all the things that we want food and agriculture systems to do, provide nourishment, be economically sustainable and protect the environment? What are the kinds of incentives that will work?
So it's a bit referring to what Carl just said, it's about supporting people rather than saying, no, you can't do that.
Right.
And then them working on a piece of land and then it becomes unproductive because the soil's just drained of nutrients. So it's just help enable better technical support in areas where that's needed. But it's also, I heard from a colleague in South Africa who just want to share an example that's a type of an incentive. In their grasslands, they've got communities that are living there, and they've lived there in these protected areas for a long time, so they're sort of part of the landscape.
Right.
And they historically haven't necessarily been incentivized and supported and had their voices at the table. But what they are seeing now is a landscape planning process that involves the communities at the center of it, because they're the ones that are going to be delivering the management plan at the end. And those communities have livestock. It's part of their historical culture, but they're also living in really important grasslands. So the benefits are for them personally to be participating in this so that they can sustain themselves and have good production and feed themselves on the land. But there's also the other external benefits of South Africa more generally, knowing that these important grasslands, as I mentioned before, water towers, are then going to have people on the ground protecting them.
Right.
So they have also got a law in South Africa that is about incentivizing and giving these communities who are delivering the landscape protection and the landscape management in the long run, they're actually getting a reward financially for making sure that they're following the plan that they were part of helping produce.
Absolutely.
So those are the sorts of things, that's just one example, but it's really about ensuring that those people living on the ground feel like they can continue and have a good quality of life, as everybody is just trying to do,
Absolutely.
but in amongst their landscape.
Absolutely, and you said something really important, that people are part of these landscapes, and we can't forget that. It's not just about pollinators, although they're important. It's not just about the small animals that Carolyn loves so much. It's about all of the people who are part of these systems. You mentioned something about the technical support that's needed, and in so many countries where grasslands are in jeopardy, there is a huge lack of extension services and technical support. It comes from NGOs like WWF. It doesn't come from governments. So Carolyn, and Karina, maybe all of you, if you can comment on this, how do we get governments to again support extension services instead of, allowing companies to provide it? I'm glad that NGOs like WWF do, but we need governments to support real technical assistance for the people who manage grasslands so that they can survive. And how do we change that policy?
I think that's a long journey of advocacy that is really different between different countries, because different countries value their grasslands and savannas in different ways. And some countries, such as South Africa, have really centred people in the conversation around grasslands and savannas, which is really fundamental, and other countries haven't. And there are really different pathways
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Just to complement that, I'm thinking about some of the Asian landscapes where Cole referred to kind of the overgrazing that exists. In some of those landscapes, like Mongolia, the policy has sort of driven people to be less nomadic and more kind of stable, and that's what's led to these also increased numbers of herds. So that incentive is obviously if people wanting to make a better life and a living for themselves, that's what they're going to follow. So it's about thinking about, for the policymakers, what makes sense for our landscapes and for our communities, and making sure that that's taken into account. My sense is that, my hope is that would, particularly with the attention that we're seeing on COP and the pledges that we need to see coming out of this, that would start to shift. But it really does need to be applied by the local decision makers in what makes sense in their country and their landscapes with their people.
For sure.
And their biodiversity.
It has to be so place-based and not even national-based in so many ways. It has to be very community-based in how these decisions are made. So I've heard a huge call from people like me, honestly, over the last few days to make the next COP the food COP, right? And while that sounds so great to me, I think it should be the food and agriculture COP. It should not, because for so long it took a lot of work to get agriculture talked about at these climate, around climate talks. And so how do we get grasslands, talked about at COP27 in Egypt? What would you want to happen next year that is not happening this year? This is a great event. It's very small. How can we get in the blue and green zones and make sure that these discussions are in front of people who are making these decisions?
So my opening gambit is that we need to build stronger coalitions and really start to coalesce around all of these important systems, because there are lots of people doing work on them in different parts of the world.
Right.
And it's something that I think forests has had a long time of that coming. So
Sure.
there's lots of people working on forests in so many different guises. And that's happening for grasslands and savannas, and you're starting to see some research coming through that's going to be really helpful to be applied, but we need to really come together around that and start to have a unified voice about what's really important in these grasslands systems.
Momentum,
and have
yeah.
them at the table and level that playing field.
Absolutely, absolutely. Cole, any thoughts? Or, maybe I could ask you what you would tell delegates at COP right now about the importance of grasslands and what you would want them to know from a farmer perspective. Take your time. It's a hard question. And
What would I tell them?
you can say it, where you're among friends.
I think, well, grasslands, they're I'm struggling.
No, it's fine. I maybe at a sort of more local level, you're talking to people in your community every day about the work that you do, or you're interacting with people, let's say. What do you want them to know as we sort of move these conversations forward? And so maybe it's not at COP, it's your local grocery retailer or somebody you interact with at the post office.
The whole landscapes themselves, like they are interlinked completely, and the grasslands our landscapes are quite limited in what they're able to do in terms of the type of functions they perform, and grassland is such a huge part of that, and it's just being so overlooked.
Yeah.
And as you said, the tree planting train is just coming through so quickly that I think we're going to lose so much so quickly in terms of my landscape in the Highlands, in the Highlands. Grassland has a huge role to play, and it's the speed that everything's moving that I'm really worried about.
Absolutely, and the intensity of it.
And I just don't know how to build up a shield against that is able to address these massive issues that we're needing to address, and that trees are also able to address. But how to tell that story in a way that we can get it together in a maybe COP27 type situation where we actually present something that is a story.
Very cohesive, and gets people's attention. And I agree that needs to happen, and that collaboration is key. And so, Carolyn, if you can talk about the collaboration that is necessary among NGOs like WWF and researchers like yourself, and farmers like Cole and many others.
Yeah, I'm so delighted to sit on this stage because I'm so excited particularly to have met Karina and Cole. So, absolutely, all of these collaborations are so essential because, as Karina was saying, I think that there is a space now for collective advocacy that has really worked to the advantage of forests for a while. And maybe it's just that savannas and grasslands is a real mouthful, and that we need to think about ways in which we're umbrellaing the grassy biomes of the world, or the processes that are structuring them as well, the coevolution with animals and fire and people that has taken place in these grassy ecosystems. And So absolutely, this kind of, I don't think we'll move forward without that collective voice, without that collaboration.
And semantics really matter, right? And vocabulary and how we talk about things.
Absolutely. I just every day I've been turning on the radio, Amazon's converting to Savannah. You know, we must really kind of get to grips with our language and it be very clear on agreed definitions that are rooted in ecology rather than rooted in economics.
Before I turn it to questions from the audience, is there a way to work with the forest people on this so that we can make that part of every conversation that they have?
Yeah, I think we need to start talking about all natural ecosystems. It's not forests, grasslands, savannas. And on that point about language and semantics being so important, in whichever part of your world you are, you refer to your landscape of these grassy biomes in a different way.
Sure.
There's so many different words, and I think that partly demonstrates the incredible richness and diversity that these landscapes bring, but it also creates this kind of, there isn't one terminology that we're using collectively, and depending on how you look at them, you know, there's a whole framing called rangelands, which incorporates a lot of those, but it in some languages it conjures up a sort of negative association where you're just putting a lot of cattle on the land, which is a bit like what Cole referred to. So yeah, I think we need to talk about all natural ecosystems and recognise the value that each of them bring, because otherwise, if we just focus on grasslands or savannas now, in a few years' time, we're going to be in the same place and gone, oh, did we forget about wetlands? Did we forget about peatlands? So it's really about the value that all of the systems and their intrinsic benefits provide us.
A truly holistic approach.
Yeah.
Any other comments before we turn to questions? We can in questions. Thank you all so much. Let's give these panelists a round of applause. Very difficult conversation. My colleague Alexina will have a roving mic for folks who want to ask questions. Right here, great.
Oh, sure. Sorry. Thank you very much. That was a really fascinating session. I suppose you read or hear quite a lot about the value of natural grasslands, biomes, the Savannah, Sahel, Central Asian steppes, from a biodiversity perspective. But then you'll also hear the same people arguing that grasslands which have been created through the intervention of man should be reforested. And so Scotland's grasslands and open ground areas are a good example of that. I was wondering if you could perhaps speak about the biodiversity importance of these semi-natural grasslands in the likes of Scotland, as opposed to perhaps, or alongside the importance of, for instance, the steppes, which have not been perhaps created through the intervention of man.
That's such an interesting question. Cole, do you have thoughts first?
I just find it very interesting that there's that separation. Often you see that separation between sort of landscapes which human was involved in, and somehow those which weren't. Because in the case of Scotland, like we know that humans have been here since the trees have, in terms of the Ice Age, moved back, and we've been part of this landscape since everything else has been part of this landscape. So separating us from the rest of the world, for me, is really inherently problematic. And when we talk about sort of restoring to some sort of a landscape to something that didn't have man in it, didn't have humans in it, what are we talking about? I know that a lot of the great grasslands and savannas have evolved over many thousands of years with communities of humans interacting with the landscape, with the flora and fauna within that landscape, in a way that it's all co-evolved. So just if we're not talking about us within the world and it's seen as something separate, what are we imagining we're returning to? because I'm not sure what that is, or I'm not sure anyone knows what that is. We've always been here.
Or if we even want it, that's not the kind of world we want, probably.
Yeah, I don't know. It's quite a question that sort of there's a lot of talk about restoring, going back to something that was untouched by human hands, and what is that? When was that?
Please, of course.
Just add to that, because we often also talk about wild places and places that are far away from people, and we often
Right.
talk about this in the global south, with, in the deepest parts of Africa and stuff, but people have been living and evolving in these landscapes for like a very long time, so we can't really divorce ecosystems and
Right.
people over the vast majority of the earth. And so this concept of like semi-natural wild landscapes, there's terminology and ideologies behind that we actually need to step back from.
Great point. Thank you so much. Any thoughts before we turn?
I mean, I think they've covered it, but it is very difficult to say, what was natural. I think the only thing I would add is that I think the rate of change that we have seen
Absolutely.
over the most recent years is really making a stark difference to the evolution that we saw previous to that. So when you look at the extent of change that's happened, in the UK, for example, we've lost, we've converted over 90% of our land, or it's degraded our grasslands. So we're probably one of the worst biodiverse landscapes across all of the countries in the world. And it's just the speed that it's happening. And that's what we need to kind of put the brakes on and think about. What is our relationship with the land, and how can we continue to exist sustainably, getting the most out of what we have available to us, but without actually going, oh, we've just kind of, that bit of land doesn't work anymore, so let's just clear this bit and continue. So I think it's really about putting the brakes on that speed and taking a step back and going, how can we actually bring back the nutrients that will bring back this food production, biodiversity mix that we need.
Absolutely, those multiple benefits. There's another question.
Yes, thank you. Hi, I'm actually coming from Finland. We are promoting this carbon action and regenerative agriculture. And thank you, this was really interesting discussion, interesting panel. What we are doing in this carbon action, we are researching carbon sequestration and holistic management in grasslands. And we do see now that we do get a lot of more carbon sequestration when we are doing this holistic grazing. And for the next COP meeting, this should be interesting. But then I also want to point out, I really appreciate that you bring the biodiversity and climate together. And that should be something for the future COP meetings. Like we are now trying to find this carbon verification system in our work, but to combine biodiversity with the carbon, I think that would be the future to see for the multi-benefits. And then finally, third point, a question. Did you mention soil manifesto? Did I hear right?
Soy manifesto, sorry.
Thank you so much for your comment. Anyone want to?
I think I just probably to comment that we've got these big separate COP events going on, and yeah, they need to come together. We can't just talk about climate and then, we've got the Biodiversity COP coming up next year. We can't then just talk about that separately. And then the desertification focus. So we've got to bring all of these things together because they are intrinsically interlinked. So
Absolutely.
I agree.
Is there another question?
Yeah, as much as anything to give some encouragement to us. So Ian and I work for Farmer, and back in the summer we launched a coalition along with bumblebee conservation and with butterfly conservation called Grasslands Plus. And we used a marketing activation. And over the last 4 months, we've had 8,000 people write to their members of parliament about grasslands. This is not petitions or signatures, this is writing to their members of parliament about the importance of grasslands for all of those reasons, for biodiversity, for well-being, for food systems. So I do feel that we're beginning to get some traction. And then about a month ago, just before the real COP activity started getting going, we brought a panel of people together did a global event on the importance of grasslands, and it was superbly attended. So having this kind of conversation this evening is really magnificent, and it's beginning to do exactly what we're talking about, which is getting coalitions of the industry together so we can start making a difference. So I'm hugely encouraged. So I don't have a particular question per se, but there is a lot going on. If we can start bringing all of this activity together, I think we will start to move at pace in the right way, not in the wrong way, but we'll start to move at pace, getting grasslands on the agenda.
That's
So
great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm I'm wondering, given the benefits of grasslands for biodiversity and conservation, is the Great Green Wall project of afforesting the Sahel perhaps a bit misguided?
Yes. I'm happy to talk about it at length, but that will probably take a while. Look, I think really the nub of that issue is that is also a very arid part of the world. Trees use water. So, and people in those landscapes are also dependent on surface water flows. So there is the great potential for there to be direct and demonstrable negative impacts on people. This actually did happen in South Africa. South Africa has an amazing program called Working for Water, where basically there were invasive tree species that were spreading across numerous catchments. And you might have heard about that. Be happening in the first place.
So many unintended consequences from well-intentioned people and programs. Any other questions?
Just to say, it's great to hear this thing about the wasteland and how, when I first went into farming as first generation farmer, I just thought I need to produce more from my grass, and obviously we weren't putting fertilizer on, but we're still trying to manage and reseed and get really productive grasses. That whole sense about that was the expected thing to do, and I think a lot of the advisory services, the extension services that you talk about, would still be pushing that message about productive grassland rather than unproductive grassland. And I'm wondering, as a sort of policy lever, and I don't know what you think about this, Karina, from the UK's point of view, but this biodiversity net gain duty in the Environment Bill, I'm just wondering how much that can be applied to land use changes more generally. I think it's tended to be think of in terms of builders, and offsetting biodiversity loss from putting down concrete. But in terms of land use change, it seems to me there's a powerful lever potentially for us in Scotland, where we are replacing diverse grassland with Sitka spruce, and there's a biodiversity net loss. Whether we could be using that legal power to maybe try and push things in a better direction.
Yeah, I think we need to try and identify where those kind of policy levers are that we can help, I guess, steer in the right direction rather than the wrong direction. And I'm actually going to use an example of forest here, because when you can look at forest restoration, but if it's the wrong restoration, then they're just going to be empty forests. And so it's the same with grasslands and any other natural ecosystem, that you're looking to restore to a state that will bring back the biodiversity and that will bring back the services that system has intrinsically got within it. So I think it's about identifying where those kind of policy levers are that you can start to nudge in the right direction. And this kind of advocacy piece is really important. And those that know the systems in the countries are best placed to help voice that and help steer that, and then bringing in the institutions that can start to nudge that. And you can see at this COP where that's happening. There's a lot of where the forest shift has been, and that change that we're really seeing and that focus on forests has come from a lot of years of advocacy and leveraging certain policies and pushing for certain policies in the right direction. I'm finding that in my role at the moment, a lot of what I'm doing when I'm brought into kind of the advocacy pieces that WWF is doing, it's often around just adding the word and conversion, deforestation and conversion. So it's really just starting to try and, if you can't get, the big change in there that you need from the outset, what can you start to push it in the right direction that's really going to help steer towards the change that you need? Because I think it's really clear that from when you're starting to move agendas, if you go in too hard and too fast, everyone kind of gets very defensive and puts their backs up. So how can you just start to steer, and who do you need alongside you to help guide that ship, as it were? Does that answer your question?
That's great.
In South Africa or Costa Rica, there's more advanced legislation. But in the UK, we have this biodiversity net gain duty in the Environment Bill. And it just feels to me like we could potentially, if that applied to Forestry Commission, for example, or if it applied to all the water companies or to any land use change, that it had to increase biodiversity. Because we've spent so much time as an explicit policy of reducing biodiversity with pesticides, with the sort of monocultures we've created. We've been setting out to reduce biodiversity for 70 years, and whether the biodiversity net gain duty can be somehow leveraged to try to change that. So.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think we should be trying to do what we can, where we can, for sure.
Fantastic. Any other comments or questions? Please.
Thanks for that. My question is, I guess, bringing it down from the policy level to a more personal level. When you all first started talking, I was actually struggling to picture grasslands in my head and what we meant by grasslands. And I was wondering what you thought, I guess, from a UK perspective, maybe talking from me, but in other contexts as well. How can we get to know our grasslands better? And how can we begin to build a connection or understanding of what a healthy grassland looks like?
That's a great question.
My opening gambit would be to speak to look at Plant Life's Coalition. I think it's a really good question, and I think it's a really good point, brings out a really good point, is that people don't necessarily understand what good looks like. And until we start to tell those stories and share those stories and really highlight what good looks like, it becomes, it's really difficult. And I think that's why, when thinking about this event, I really wanted to have somebody that could talk to what it means in their landscape, because it just helps ground the discussion and the conversation. I also realised as I was, one of my colleagues asked me to write a blog on the grasslands, and I was thinking, he pointed me to a document that was like quite heavy and technical, and I was like, I'm not very inspired by this. And then I went for a walk one morning, and I realised that the walk that I'd been doing every single day through lockdown was in a small protected grassland habitat, and I suddenly realised that it represented this tiny sort of 40 acre spot was representative of everything that we're trying to do globally with the grass and savannas. They actually, it's a protected area. It's managed because it's really rich in biodiversity. It's got a cultural, historical context because there's an Iron Age fort at the top of the hill, or the remains of. It's managed holistically through livestock, so that the livestock that are put in to graze are doing the job of restoring the grass in a natural way at certain times of year. And it just was this light bulb moment for me. It's like, that's on my doorstep. And when I shared that story, and then I talked through to the bigger picture, the global grasslands that are so immense and enormous and magnificent that we are overlooking, it just really grounded it for me. my colleague was like, oh, I'd sort of forgotten that the UK has, has grasslands. I just look at it as countryside. So again, I think it's about that, being better at storytelling and getting messages across through tangible links to people. And that might be different in different parts of the world.
Absolutely. Yeah, we definitely have a communication problem, but I think that's such a beautiful point to end on, that personal story. Thank you so much, Karina, Cole, and Carolyn. This has been a wonderful conversation. I've learned so much. So thank you all. Please give them a round of applause, please. And thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it.